When most people hear the name Hastur, they encounter it through one context above all others: the Cthulhu Mythos, the sprawling, interconnected body of cosmic horror fiction built around the work of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, the American writer who, in the 1920s and 1930s, constructed one of the most influential fictional mythologies in the history of the genre. Lovecraft's mythos introduced the world to beings of incomprehensible scale and indifference, ancient entities existing far beyond human understanding, operating on timescales that made civilizations seem like brief flickers of light. Among these mysterious entities is Hastur, who is recognized as one of the Great Old Ones. It has been written about by the same authors, in the same tradition, using the same framework that Lovecraft established. If you came to this video knowing Hastur as a Lovecraftian entity, you are not wrong. But here is where the story gets more interesting and more complicated, because Hastur did not begin with Lovecraft. Lovecraft did not create this name. He borrowed it, as he openly acknowledged, from another writer who had used it before him, and that writer in turn had borrowed it from someone else. The name Hastur passed through at least 3 distinct authors across several decades before it became the cosmic entity that the Cthulhu Mythos is known for, and at each stage of that journey, it was transformed almost beyond recognition. Understanding what Hastur became requires understanding where it started, and where it started is very far from the cosmic horror tradition most people associate with the name. Before we go any further, if this kind of deep dive is something you value, please take a moment to subscribe and follow the channel. Each episode in this series is dedicated to tracing one mythology fully: its origins, its development, its internal logic, the stories attached to it, and what it meant to the people who wrote it and read it. There is a great deal more coming, and subscribing ensures you will be there when it does. It also genuinely helps us keep making this kind of content, and we are grateful for every person who does it. Now, back to Hastur. One of the most striking things about Hastur, and one that was entirely deliberate across all the texts that developed the mythology, is that the entity has no single fixed appearance. Unlike many figures in mythology or fiction, Hastur was never pinned down to one definitive form. This was not an oversight. It was a choice, and understanding why that choice was made tells us a great deal about the nature of the entity itself. Across the various source texts, Hastur was associated with 2 distinct kinds of imagery, one tied to the figure known as the King in Yellow, and one tied to the entity's cosmic formless nature as a Great Old One. The first and most visually concrete image associated with Hastur came from Robert W. Chambers' 1895 collection The King in Yellow. Within those stories, the presence connected to Hastur was most often represented through the figure of the King in Yellow, a tall, shrouded entity draped in tattered robes of pale and faded yellow, its face concealed behind a white, expressionless mask. The robes were described as hanging loosely, as though whatever wore them might not have the kind of solid form that clothing was designed to cover. The mask was smooth, blank, and still, the face of something that had chosen concealment over revelation. What the mask concealed, the texts never fully described, and that silence was itself significant. This figure moved through the stories as a presence rather than a character, seen at the edges of perception, encountered in visions, described by those whose minds had already begun to come apart. The second kind of imagery associated with Hastur came from the broader Cthulhu Mythos tradition, particularly through the work of August Derleth. In this framework, Hastur was understood as a cosmic entity of immense scale, not a figure that could be fully seen or comprehended, but a presence of vast, formless or near-formless nature. Derleth associated Hastur with air and wind. This suggested an entity that did not have a fixed physical body in any sense that human beings could meaningfully engage with. Some later writers in the mythos tradition described Hastur with physical features more typical of the Great Old Ones: vast, tentacled, enormous beyond human scale. But these descriptions were never as authoritative or as consistent as the King in Yellow imagery, and they varied significantly between authors. Across all the texts that contributed to the Hastur mythology, certain attributes remained constant. The entity was ancient beyond any meaningful human reckoning, existing in a relationship with time so fundamentally different from the human experience of it, that asking how old Hastur was made about as much sense as asking how old gravity was. It was cosmic in scale, associated not with any location on Earth, but with the star cluster of the Hyades in the constellation Taurus, near the bright star Aldebaran, which placed Hastur not in some separate supernatural realm, but in the actual observable sky above every human being. And yet, despite that proximity, it was entirely indifferent to humanity. Not hostile, not benevolent, but operating on a register so far removed from human concerns that the difference between those two things was, from Hastur's perspective, no difference at all. What connection it did have to human beings ran not through the physical world, but through the mind, through thought, through perception, through the slow deterioration of the mental frameworks people relied upon to make sense of reality. With that foundation in place, we can now trace how this entity came to exist in the first place. And that journey begins not with Lovecraft and not with Chambers, but with a quiet story about a shepherd and his god written in 1891 by a man named Ambrose Bierce. The name Hastur first appeared in print in 1891 in a short story by the American writer Ambrose Bierce titled Haida the Shepherd, which was later collected in his anthology Can Such Things Be, published in 1893. In Bierce's telling, Hastur was not a terrifying force. The story described Hastur as a god of shepherds, a pastoral deity, benevolent in nature, who presided over flocks and the quiet lives of those who tended them. The central character, Haida, was a young shepherd whose entire existence was dedicated to devotion to Hastur. He lived a simple and earnest life, making offerings and praising Hastur with sincerity. The core tension of Bierce's story, however, was not about Hastur's power or wrath. It was about happiness and the elusive nature of joy. Haida sought happiness as though it were a person, a figure he could find and hold, and each time he came close, happiness fled from him. The story was, at its heart, a meditation on the condition of seeking contentment rather than simply living within it. Bierce did not describe Hastur's appearance, did not assign the deity a gender definitively, and did not elaborate on any supernatural characteristics beyond the divine oversight of herding. It is essential to understand this first incarnation of the name because it stands in such complete contrast to what Hastur would become. In Bierce's hands, Hastur was gentle. In the hands of those who came after, Hastur became something else entirely. It is also worth noting that Bierce had previously created another piece of writing that would later be absorbed into the same expanding mythology, though he did not connect it to Hastur himself. In 1886, 5 years before Haida the Shepherd, Bierce published a story called An Inhabitant of Carcosa, which introduced the name Carcosa, a desolate, ruined, ancient city associated with death and strangeness. Bierce wrote Carcosa as a place discovered by a wandering spirit, a place of forgotten civilization and silent desolation. He gave it no deity, no ruler. It was simply a haunted landscape at the edge of something incomprehensible. These two names, Hastur and Carcosa, existed in Bierce's work as separate creations, unconnected to each other. It would take another writer, a few years later, to bring them together. In 1895, an American author named Robert W. Chambers published a collection of loosely connected stories under the title The King in Yellow. This book changed everything about the name Hastur. Chambers borrowed the name directly from Bierce, and he borrowed Carcosa as well, but he wove them together into something that Bierce had never intended. In Chambers's work, Hastur was no longer a shepherd's god. The name appeared in connection with an entity of vast and terrible significance, one tied to a mysterious, forbidden play, a cursed symbol, and a city at the edge of reality. The structure of The King in Yellow was unusual. The first 4 stories, The Repairer of Reputations, The Mask, In the Court of the Dragon, and The Yellow Sign, formed a loose, interconnected mythology. Within Chambers' book existed a fictional play. a play that existed only inside the story's world, not in reality. This fictional play also happened to share the same name as the book itself, The King in Yellow. So to be clear, Robert W. Chambers wrote a real book called The King in Yellow, and inside that real book, he invented a fictional play also called The King in Yellow, which the characters in his stories could read and interact with. This fictional play, as described within the stories, was a theatrical work in 2 acts. The first act was said to be perfectly ordinary, perhaps even enjoyable, the kind of thing any audience might sit through without concern. It was the second act that caused the damage. Once a person read the second act of this fictional play, something happened to them. Their mind began to deteriorate. Their grip on reality loosened. The play, within the logic of Chambers' stories, had the power to destroy the sanity of anyone who read it. It had been banned. People knew what it did. And yet whenever a character in the stories came across a copy, they read it anyway, because the first act had already drawn them in, and by the time the second act began, it was too late to stop. Chambers never reproduced the full text of this fictional play within his actual book. He only quoted fragments. This was, whether intentional or not, an extraordinarily effective literary choice. The reader was told the play was dangerous, shown its effects on characters, given only partial glimpses of its contents, and left to construct the horror themselves. The name Hastur appeared within these stories in references, as a name associated with the mythology surrounding the King in Yellow, with Carcosa, and with the Lake of Hali. Chambers wrote of these as places and names from within the cursed play, though he deliberately blurred the line between the fictional play's content and the reality of the story's world. The Lake of Hali appeared in the stories as a body of water associated with Carcosa, a dark, cloud-covered lake, silent and vast, somewhere beyond ordinary geography. Chambers's character in The Repairer of Reputations referenced the Lake of Hali as part of a larger cosmology, a place that held significance in the mythology of the King in Yellow. Carcosa, in Chambers's stories, was no longer simply the ruined city Bierce had imagined. It became something more ambiguous, a place that might exist in another dimension, or in a dying world, or in the mind of one who had read too much of the forbidden play. Characters spoke of Carcosa with longing and dread simultaneously. Within the mythology Chambers constructed, the King in Yellow was a specific figure, an entity described in robes of tattered yellow, wearing a pale mask over what lay beneath. The King in Yellow was associated with Hastur, though Chambers did not always distinguish clearly whether the King in Yellow was Hastur, was an avatar of Hastur, or was simply a separate being operating within the same mythos. This deliberate ambiguity was characteristic of Chambers' approach throughout The King in Yellow. He suggested rather than stated. He named rather than described. The King in Yellow appeared in the stories as a presence at the edges, in visions, in the content of the cursed play, in the madness of those who had been consumed by it. The figure was associated with decay, with entropy, with the slow dissolution of things. Where the King in Yellow moved through the world of the stories, things came apart. Sanity, order, life itself. Alongside this figure came the yellow sign. The yellow sign was a symbol, a specific described glyph, though Chambers never gave a fully precise visual description of it within the text. What he made clear was its effect. In the story, The Yellow Sign, a character named Walter Doris encountered the symbol on the person of a strange, corpse-like watchman he repeatedly saw outside his studio. From the moment he saw the sign, something began. He was unable to forget it. He was compelled, against his rational will, to seek it out, to think about it, to find it again. When a woman named Tessie came into contact with the yellow sign as well, the same process began in her. The yellow sign, in Chambers' fiction, did not simply destroy. It claimed. Those who encountered it did not immediately die. They were gradually drawn in, their minds redirected, their autonomy eroded, until whatever the sign represented came for them fully. The ending of The Yellow Sign, which involved the mysterious watchman arriving at last, having been called by the sign, resulting in the deaths of the story's characters, was left deliberately indirect. Chambers showed the aftermath rather than the event itself. This was the nature of Hastur's mythology as Chambers built it. Not brute destruction, but insidious, spreading corruption that worked through symbols, through words, through a play that could not be unread. Even though Chambers introduced the yellow sign, he never explained its origin within the text. He gave no account of who made it, where it came from, or how it came to exist. Later writers working within the Cthulhu Mythos tradition generally treated the yellow sign as something that had not been created in any conventional sense, not designed or made by a person or entity the way a human craftsman makes a tool. Instead, it was understood as something that had simply emerged from or been manifested by the force it represented. In this reading, the yellow sign was less an object that someone had produced, and more an expression of Hastur's nature, a symbol that existed because Hastur existed. Some later mythos writers went further and suggested that the yellow sign was in some sense of Hastur itself, not created by the entity but emanating from it, a mark that carried something of Hastur's nature within it. This would explain both its power and the fact that physical destruction of the sign did not necessarily undo its effects on those who had seen it. H.P. Lovecraft encountered Chambers' work and recognized its value immediately. Lovecraft wrote admiringly of the King in Yellow in his 1927 essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, describing Chambers' mythology as one of the most effective uses of cosmic dread in American fiction. In Lovecraft's own fiction, Hastur received a single, brief but significant inclusion. In the short story, The Whisperer in Darkness, published in 1931 in Weird Tales magazine, Lovecraft listed Hastur among a number of entities in a passage describing cosmic beings of vast power, what he categorized as the Great Old Ones, ancient entities who existed before humanity and who operated on a scale entirely beyond human comprehension. By placing Hastur within the framework of the Great Old Ones, alongside Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, and others, Lovecraft formally absorbed the name into his mythos. The shepherd god of Bierce, the shadowy king of Chambers, was now situated within a cosmology that gave it a specific category, a specific class of existence, and a specific relationship to the rest of Lovecraft's created universe. However, Lovecraft chose not to develop Hastur further in his own writing. He acknowledged the mythology Chambers had built, incorporated the name into his shared framework, and moved on. This restraint was significant. It left Hastur as a presence within the Cthulhu Mythos without being fully defined by Lovecraft himself, which left the door open for the writers who followed. The most expansive and detailed development of Hastur as a fully realized mythological figure came from August Derleth, an American author and editor who became one of the primary architects of the Cthulhu Mythos after Lovecraft's death in 1937. Derleth co-founded Arkham House, a publishing company dedicated to preserving and expanding the Lovecraftian tradition, and in doing so became the person most responsible for shaping how subsequent generations understood and related to the entities Lovecraft had sketched out. Derleth took the name Hastur and built around it a far more structured mythology than either Chambers or Lovecraft had provided. In Derleth's framework, Hastur was given a specific place in the cosmos. The entity was associated with the star cluster known as the Hyades, located in the constellation Taurus, and more specifically with the region near the bright star Aldebaran. This was not a poetic or symbolic association. Derleth placed Hastur in the actual astronomical sky, making the entity part of the observable universe rather than something existing in a separate supernatural realm. Derleth also established one of the most important structural relationships in the entire Cthulhu mythos, the enmity between Hastur and Cthulhu. In Derleth's conception, these two entities were half-brothers, bound by a relationship that was ancient, irreconcilable, and entirely beyond human politics or morality. And yet, despite establishing this enmity clearly, Derleth never explained in the primary texts what the conflict was actually about. What the texts and the broader mythos tradition suggested, without ever stating directly, was that the conflict was not the result of any single event or grievance. It was structural. Derleth associated Cthulhu with water, with the crushing depths of the ocean, with the drowned world beneath the Pacific. Hastur, by contrast, was associated with air, with wind, with the open sky and the void above it. They were opposing forces, inherently in tension with each other in the way that air and water have always worked against one another. The enmity between Hastur and Cthulhu was therefore less like a rivalry between two individuals with a history, and more like the conflict between two incompatible principles of nature. Some later writers working within the mythos tradition added a further dimension to this. The idea that shared lineage between cosmic entities of this nature produced not kinship, but competition. Two beings of equal antiquity and power, sharing a common origin but representing opposing forces, with no common ground between them. It is worth pausing here on a question that naturally follows from the half-brother relationship. If Hastur and Cthulhu were half-brothers, what was their parentage? Who or what produced them? It is a reasonable question, and the honest answer is that Derleth himself never clearly specifies in those same texts who their shared parent or parents were. He asserted the connection without fully explaining the lineage behind it. Later writers working within the mythos tradition attempted to fill that gap, and the figure most commonly proposed as a shared ancestor was Yog-Sothoth, one of the outer gods in Lovecraft's cosmology. In Lovecraft's own story, The Dunwich Horror, published in 1929, Yog-Sothoth fathered offspring with a human woman, which established within the mythology that Yog-Sothoth was capable of producing descendants across different kinds of being. Some later mythos writers extended this logic to suggest a broader cosmic lineage that could account for both Cthulhu and Hastur as descendants of Yog-Sothoth, or a similar outer god. Derleth also formalized the epithet by which Hastur became most widely known, him who is not to be named. This title placed Hastur within a long tradition of entities whose names were considered too dangerous to speak aloud. Within the logic of the mythos, speaking or writing Hastur's name could draw attention to the speaker, could act, under the right circumstances, as a kind of invocation. To name the entity was to risk calling it, and so it was not named. Two locations were consistently associated with Hastur across the entire mythology: Carcosa and the Lake of Hali. Carcosa, as established by Bierce in 1886 and expanded by Chambers in 1895, occupied an unusual position in the mythology. It was a place that had existed, a city, a civilization, but which had passed into a state beyond ordinary existence. In Bierce's original story, An Inhabitant of Carcosa, the narrator was the spirit of a long-dead man wandering through a landscape he could not recognize, unable to find the city that had once been his home, seeing only wild and empty terrain where civilization had once stood. Carcosa was a place that time had erased so completely that not even its ruins remained. Only the landscape continued, indifferent and silent. Chambers took this image and amplified it into something stranger. In the world of the King in Yellow, Carcosa was a place that existed at the edge of the knowable world, possibly in another dimension, possibly in the deep past, possibly accessible only through the distorted perception of someone whose mind had already been altered by the forbidden play. It was associated with endings, with the last stages of something, with the silence that comes after everything has been said and there is nothing left to say. Hastur's connection to Carcosa was never fully explained in any single text. The relationship was one of association. The name Hastur appeared in proximity to Carcosa throughout the mythology, suggesting a deep and fundamental connection without specifying its exact nature. Whether Hastur ruled Carcosa, dwelled within it, created it, or simply shared the same mythological space, was left entirely to inference. This was, again, deliberate. The mythology consistently refused to explain itself completely. The Lake of Hali was a creation specific to Chambers. In The King in Yellow, the Lake of Hali was described in fragments across the stories. A body of water, dark and vast, lying beneath a sky perpetually covered with clouds through which no stars were visible. It existed near or within Carcosa. The lake appeared in the fragments of the fictional play that Chambers quoted in his stories. Characters spoke of the Lake of Hali in ways that suggested it was a place of enormous significance, a place where something waited or resided. In the broader mythos, as Derleth developed it, the Lake of Hali became associated with Hastur's domain, a counterpart, perhaps, to the oceanic depths associated with Cthulhu. The lake, the star cluster of the Hyades, and the ruined city of Carcosa formed a triad of associated imagery around the entity. 3 different kinds of place, all connected to the same presence. What these places shared was this: they were all images of aftermath, of what remained after meaning had departed. Carcosa was a city whose civilization was gone. The Lake of Hali was a body of water under a sky with no visible stars. These were landscapes of absence, places where something had once been and no longer was, or places where something had not yet arrived but was moving slowly toward arrival. Hastur existed in that space between what had been and what was coming. And that ambiguity, that refusal to be located precisely in time or place, was fundamental to what Hastur was. Across the full body of texts that developed the Hastur mythology, from Bierce through Chambers, through Lovecraft, through Derleth, and the broader Cthulhu Mythos tradition, a consistent set of powers and capabilities emerged around the entity. The most fundamental power attributed to Hastur was the ability to affect the human mind at a distance. This was not the crude physical horror of many mythological monsters. Hastur's influence operated on cognition, on perception, on the architecture of thought itself. The entity did not need to be physically present to cause harm. Its ideas, its symbols, and its name were sufficient vectors for its influence to travel. This connected directly to Hastur's relationship with madness. Those who came into meaningful contact with the mythology, through the yellow sign, through reading the forbidden play, through certain rituals or invocations, experienced the progressive deterioration of ordinary mental function. Those who lost their sanity to Hastur's influence were not simply confused or distressed. They became oriented toward something. Drawn toward Carcosa, drawn toward the Lake of Hali, drawn, ultimately, toward the entity itself. Hastur was also associated throughout the texts with decay and entropy, not the explosive, sudden destruction of a natural disaster, but the slow and inevitable wearing down of things. In this sense, Hastur's power was patient. It did not need to act quickly because it operated on a timescale that made human urgency irrelevant. The yellow sign functioned as a specific instrument of Hastur's power within Chambers' fiction, a mechanism through which the entity could mark and claim individuals without direct contact. Those who saw the sign were, in some sense, already claimed. The sign created a connection between the person who encountered it and whatever force the sign represented. It could be transmitted from one person to another. It could persist, working its effects silently over time, and it acted as a kind of signal, drawing toward the marked person whatever the sign had called. The association with air and wind, established by Derleth, suggested that Hastur's presence could manifest through atmospheric phenomena like the movement of wind, the spaces that appear empty but may not be. Hastur was not a being of solid matter that could be confronted or contained. It was a being of the spaces between things and was present in what could not be seen or touched. Finally, the prohibition on naming itself constituted a form of power. The entity did not need to be actively present to hold power over human beings. The act of not naming it was itself an exercise of its power. Every avoidance of the name was an acknowledgement that the entity was real, dangerous, and capable of responding to the act of naming. This made Hastur's influence self-reinforcing. The more carefully people avoided the name, the more they affirmed its significance. The prohibition was both a protection against Hastur and a testament to its reach. The Mythos texts were characteristically sparse on the subject of weaknesses, particularly for cosmic-level entities. The great old ones in the Cthulhu Mythos tradition were generally presented as beings whose limitations, if they existed at all, were not comprehensible in human terms. However, within the framework Derleth established, several limiting factors emerged for Hastur specifically. The most significant was the elemental opposition between Hastur and Cthulhu. If Hastur represented air and Cthulhu represented water, their conflict was not merely a personal rivalry, but a structural one. Each embodied forces that were inherently in tension with the other. This meant that Cthulhu's presence or activity could, in theory, constrain Hastur's, and vice versa. Neither entity operated without limit in a universe where the other also existed. Their mutual enmity was itself a kind of check on both of them. Hastur's power also appeared to require certain conditions and vectors to operate effectively against human beings. The entity's influence worked primarily through transmission, through symbols like the yellow sign, through written or performed texts like the forbidden play, through specific rituals. This suggested that without these vectors, Hastur's direct reach was at least partially limited. A person who had never encountered the yellow sign, who had never read the play, who had never engaged in any ritual connected to the mythology, was not immune, but was considerably less vulnerable than one who had. This created an implicit limitation in Hastur's mode of operation. It was, in a meaningful sense, dependent on human curiosity and human choices. The play could only destroy those who chose to keep reading it. The yellow sign could only claim those who saw it. The name could only act as an invocation if it was spoken. Human beings, by actively seeking out the forbidden, were the primary mechanism through which Hastur's influence spread. The entity's reach expanded precisely because people could not leave it alone. In Chambers' stories, the yellow sign could also be physically destroyed, but the story, The Yellow Sign, suggested that physical destruction of the symbol did not undo whatever had already been done to those who had encountered it. The instrument could be removed. The effect of the instrument appeared to remain. What made the Hastur mythology endure, and what made it persist across more than a century of literary tradition, was the unusual way it handled the fundamental question of what a being like Hastur actually was. Most mythological traditions give their supernatural entities some form of comprehensible motivation. Gods and monsters, whatever their power, generally operated within frameworks that human beings could understand. Hastur, as the texts developed it, refused this framework entirely. The entity was not angry, it was not hungry, it had no desire for worship, no interest in human civilization, no preference for one outcome over another in any sense that human beings could find meaningful. Its relationship to the Lake of Hali, to Carcosa, to the forbidden play, to the yellow sign, these were not expressions of personality or desire. They were expressions of nature. They were simply what Hastur was, as unavoidable as the nature of wind or the passage of time. The warning against speaking its name was, in this light, not a warning against offending the entity or provoking its wrath. It was a warning against making oneself visible to something that otherwise had no particular reason to notice you. The name was dangerous not because Hastur was vengeful, but because Hastur was vast and indifferent, and attention from something of that nature, even indifferent attention, was not something a human being could survive intact. That is the full story of Hastur, or as full a story as the texts allow us to tell. If you have made it this far, thank you. If this episode gave you something to think about, please share it with someone who might appreciate it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And there are more episodes coming, each one dedicated to tracing the mythology of another entity, another name, another legend. We hope you will join us again for the next one. Until then, take care, and perhaps think twice before reading any play you happen to find in unusual circumstances.